Jaap-Henk is Associate Professor of Privacy Enhancing Protocols and Privacy by Design at Radboud University, Nijmegen. He is also a guest professor at Karlstad University in Sweden. And he is Associate Professor at the Law Department of the University of Groningen, so we get 3 professors for 1 prize. And he's the principal scientist of the Privacy and Identity Lab, so looks like a perfect speaker in our conference. So he was worried a little bit that Patrick Breyer already told much of what he's going to do, but it turns out that actually that is probably sort of okay, going a bit more in depth on some things. It's on CSAM, and actually that means could a snitch analyze our messages? That's what it means. Yeah, thank you.
Ben, I don't need it. No. Oh, no, you I don't need it. You. Okay, so thanks for the invitation. Thanks for having all 3 of us. And Bart mentioned that the difficult job of the presenter after lunch is to, be engaging after lunch, and then he gave me the even more daunting task of being engaging after the presentation of Bart, because I enjoyed it very much. So let's see if I can come close to that. Like I said, like Ben has said, I was a bit worried that Patrick did already talk a lot about the client-side scanning CSAM proposal, but then Bart convinced me that he didn't, and I came in later, so I didn't see what he was talking about in the beginning. So I decided to still talk about this, because I have been involved in this discussion for quite some bit, and I think it's important to discuss the things that are happening. And also because that really ties with the theme of this conference, and also as a concrete example of the crypto wars that are still raging in the world. What are we talking about? We're talking about this proposal for regulation of the European Parliament to combat child sexual abuse. And that means specifically combating any material that visually depicts child engaging in real or simulated sexual explicit conduct, etc., etc. So this is a definition taken from the directive already from 2011, and that is not only the standard thing of what we think of like child pornography as pictures, but it could also be generated pictures, anything that is related to that. So that is already the topic of what we're talking about, is this kind of material, which of course is very, very, let's say, horrible kind of content related to horrible cases of abuse. And it's of course very logical that we as a society want to combat that. But then the question is, how do we do that in a sensible, reasonable, and also workable way? And this is what the regulation tries, at least in the intent to achieve. Whether it actually achieves the goal, I beg to differ, I guess. But that's at least the clear intention. Bart already mentioned that there is, at the moment, a temporary derogation to scan for this kind of material on, for instance, cloud storage. If you have the possibility to look at the content that people upload, you are, by means of derogation that is extended to 2026, allowed to scan for these images for the possible inclusion of this CSAM material. But the Commission wanted to go further and wanted to actually impose a requirement to go for this scanning of this kind of material. So this is what this regulation is all about. And the scope is both on hosting providers that are hosting this kind of content, and on the providers of so-called interpersonal communication services. Again, something they find in another European directive from 2018, which includes services where this is only a minor ancillary feature. So even if interpersonal communication is not the main part of the service that you provide, but it is something that you provide as part of a larger service, you are potentially in scope of this regulation. And by the nature of what an interpersonal communication service means, this is things like WhatsApp, but also Zoom or even email. So that's the scope. So this is quite big scope. Then what is the rough structure of this regulation? It basically says that any of these services, any of the entities in scope offering services in Europe have to do a risk assessment, have to analyze the risk of whether their service is being used for the distribution of CSAM. And depending on the risk assessment, they have to do and take certain mitigation measures. For instance, do content moderation, if they see the content. Or do things like age verification or age assessment in other means. They also have to report about the outcome of the risk assessment to the national competent authority. And then it's up to the national competent authority to decide whether additional measures are necessary. And there's two types of measures that can be taken. One, and I will not talk about that, but I want to mention that that's the so-called blocking orders, which means that the national authority can actually issue orders to internet access services, hosting services, access services, to block certain content based on URLs. Interestingly enough, in the Netherlands, there is a current proposal under proposed, which also might put the internet access service providers, so internet service providers, may require them to block certain DNS queries. So and this is something that is against by the Society of Internet Service Providers, because they think that is overly broad kind of blocking that would take place. But like I said, I'm not going to talk about that much in this presentation, not at all, beyond this. I want to talk about this other thing that the national authorities can actually impose, and this is so-called detection order. So if, according to the risk assessment and according to the national authority, the risk that the service is being used for the distribution of CSAM is high, then a so-called detection order can be issued to the provider of that service. And in the text of the regulation, it says that in case of significant risk, such a detection order has to be can be issued, and that it can, and that in that case it will outweigh the breach of fundamental rights, which are obvious because the detection order means that the service provider will have to scan all messages being sent for the potential inclusion of CSAM. Now, what can the detection order the service provider to do? Three different things. Detection of known material, known CSAM, detection of not yet known, so-called unknown CSAM, and thirdly, the solicitation of children, grooming. So this is not only about images, but also about checking text messages for potential cases of grooming. This is why, for instance, Patrick Breyer consistently calls this proposal the chat control proposal, because it's broader than just images, it's also text. Now, the idea of the detection order is that the detection order is given to a provider of a service for no longer than 24 months. So if you get a detection order issued, it should be in place for no longer than 24 months, but then of course it can be, I guess, extended. And it's supposedly targeted and limited, but it's very unclear what that means. It is said in the regulation that it's supposed to be targeted and limited, but to all, as far as I can tell, or we can tell, because like Bart mentioned, several people, including Bart and others, have been up in arms about this proposal as well. We don't see a lot of targetedness in the proposal so far. And the detection orders have to be detect material based on indicators and technology that is provided by a special European Center for this purpose, which actually is going to be hosted next to Europe, interestingly enough. So what kind of indicators are we talking about? Indicators are images or URLs, and the images and URLs by this new center and can be submitted by the national authorities. And what should happen with the detection order? The messages being sent will be scanned based on these indicators. And if any message matches the indicator, then a report has to be filed to this EU center. Now, you as a user getting reported to the center will not be immediately notified of this taking place. This will only happen after at most 3 months or earlier if it's manifestly clear that nothing bad has happened. Anything that is not manifestly unfounded is forwarded to law enforcement. So there's a first check taking place at the center, and anything that is not manifestly unfounded, that's to say, anything that is clearly not CSAM, anything that is not clearly not CSAM, that's okay, well, is forwarded to law enforcement. Europol has access to the report database. There is no strict retention limit on these reports, and all reports, including the manifestly unfounded ones, are kept. So this is the legal part. That's the idea. Now, the elephant in the room, why this becomes interesting, is of course end-to-end encryption. Because with end-to-end encryption, if I send a funny cat, then I know I'm sending a funny cat. The recipient of that image will see a funny cat, but the service provider in the middle only sees ciphertext. Nothing that can be used for anything that implements a detection order. Now, Bart also mentioned that the European Commission, at least publicly, and several governments, including the Dutch government, have always publicly claimed that they want and are supporters of end-to-end encryption. So the regulation does not say that you have to break encryption. You have to do something else in order to do and implement the detection order. What can you do to do the detection order if you have the elephant in the room, namely end-to-end encryption, and that is client-side scanning. And actually the term client-side scanning in itself does not appear in the regulation. It's just one form of implementing the detection order that could work in the case of end-to-end encryption. And what happens there is that if I am sending this cute picture of this cat on my phone, there is a process taking place that has to take place because of the detection order. Check if that picture is CSAM or not. And if it's CSAM, then there's going to go a report to the agency. If it's not, then the picture is being sent. That is the idea of client-side scanning. And the idea is that so the detection order is put on a service provider of a communication service, and that means that the app of the communication service, so WhatsApp, Zoom, Signal, will have to have this client-side scanning code running inside the app. And like I said, there's basically 3 different types of CSAM being targeted by the regulation. The first one is this known CSAM. The second one is this unknown CSAM. And the third one is its grooming. And there's basically different techniques being proposed to detect these different kind of CSAM. And they all have their certain properties that I want to talk about, especially about the known CSAM, but also a little bit about the AI part. And so for known CSAM, there's a method called perceptual hashing that I will talk about later, which has a very, very low probability of flagging an innocent cat picture or any other picture as CSAM. So there's a very small, I think, negligible risk of false positives. But for the other 2 groups, for the things like unknown CSAM, and also for detecting grooming, there are no clear indicators of what is unknown CSAM or what is grooming. So this has to be AI-based a machine learning-based technology. And there, the problem is that there's a significant risk of false positives. And in the case of grooming especially, there has to be some form of age verification taking place, because grooming only takes place if one of the people communicating is a minor and the other is not. Now with these AI-based techniques, so detect unknown CSAM, the problem is that there is a small, but definitely not ignorable, probability of a false accept. So meaning that there's a very small probability that an innocent picture is being flagged as CSAM. And let's say, for sake of argument, that this probability is 0.1%, which is low, really low. That's, I would say, not even achieved with current technology. But this is hard to say, because actually all the technology proposed for detecting CSAM is proprietary, so we have no real way of verifying this. But based on public statements from a company like the main providers of this technology, this seems to be a very good estimate, or an overestimate of the capabilities of the technology. Now, if you consider that WhatsApp is sending 130 billion messages a day, and let's say that one of 100 contains an image and is tested, that would still mean, with this false accept ratio, 1.4 million false messages, false positives each day that would enter the center. And that could, for instance, include pictures of, your grandfather taking pictures of the grandchildren playing in the pool, a concerned parent taking pictures of his or her child, sending that to the doctor, because they could conceptually be close to CSAM, so maybe the image classifier will classify them as such. So these people will be reported. They will not know that they will be reported, but they will be reported. That's part of the problem. The other problem, of course, is that given the sheer volume of reports going to the agency, that agency will be overwhelmed. Now, for grooming, it's even more complicated, because that's even more contextual. Like, what is grooming? Like I said, it means you have to do age verification in order to even detect grooming. So this kind of and I will come back to the issue of practicality of the whole proposal, means that especially the AI-based techniques are relatively easy to disqualify as being useful, sensible, and proportional. But also that I will talk about later. What interests me most is maybe focus a little bit more about detecting the known CSAM based on perceptual hashing. Also because, at least in the Netherlands, the Dutch government is of the opinion that AI-based techniques for detecting CSAM are out of bounds, but they are definitely in favor of having a system for client-side scanning based on known CSAM, based on fingerprinting, being implemented. So what is the idea here? Perceptual hashing is a function that is mapping an image to a short fingerprint in such a way that it's one way. You cannot actually get the image out of the fingerprint, but also that there is a kind of perceptual equality measure on these fingerprints, in the sense that if you put the same or almost the same picture in the perceptual hashing, then the outcome will be the same hash. Actually, but I'm simplifying here, the outcome will be a hash that has a certain Euclidean distance close to the other image, but let's, for all practice, okay, that they are equal. So if the two images that you put in match to the same hash function, match to the same fingerprint, then they are roughly the same image. There are several products out there, PhotoDNA, PDQ, Neural Hash. They're all proprietary, so we do not officially know how they work, but they have been reverse engineered. At some point in 2021, this was a few years before the proposal from the commission came out, Apple already toyed with this idea of maybe we could do detecting CSAM on the user devices in a privacy-friendly way. So no worries, we can do it in a nice way. They called it the Apple PSI system. And I just want to briefly mention it because it's from a cryptographic point of view, it's an interesting exercise problem to study. And we see several more or less well-known cryptographers on this author list. And the idea from a cryptographic point of view is to devise a protocol where essentially you do private set intersection against the images that you as a user have, and the EU agency or whatever organization has with the fingerprints of the known CSAM. Now, there are some complicating factors that make this problem more interesting from a cryptographic point of view. One of them is, of course, that you want to do a threshold, at least in the case of Apple, they wanted to do a threshold kind of thing, like, okay, kind of like 4 strikes and you're out, like thing like, okay, 1 image is not 2 images, but if it's 3, then it's a duck, well, then it's CSAM, and then we're going to report. The most, and of course, and this is something that we have to, that they have to keep in mind, you have to do local matching, and that has to do with the fact that the fingerprints are actually, and of course the CSAM material itself is very, very sensitive, but even the fingerprints are sensitive and secret. So the matching takes place locally to avoid any kind of like leaking in the network traffic, and also to keep network traffic low. So you want to do the matching locally, but you want to do it on blinded copies of the database. So the phones, in the case of client-side scanning, will not have a copy of the fingerprints that you match against, but only a blinded copy. And that has several consequences that we will see. So there's general issues with detecting non-CSAM. Client-side scanning has to be implemented on all the phones, or at least has to be embedded in the code of every messenger that has given detection order. That means that it is not targeted limited. It's there and it's running. You could maybe activate it remotely or not, but you activate it for everybody or nobody, because the detection order itself is not targeted to any specific people. Secondly, the system is totally opaque. The hashing algorithms are proprietary, though some are reverse engineered. Even fingerprints of known CSAM are secret. So that means that independent verification of what is being scanned on the phone is totally impossible. You have blinded fingerprints of something that you don't know, so you don't know what's being detected. And basically service providers have to trust what is given to them. They are basically given a database of blinded fingerprints, and it says, that's it. But there's more. Even with the specifics of perceptual hashing, there's problems. One of the problems is that it's easy to evade. For certain known methods of perceptual hashing, rotating the image, for instance, creates a totally different fingerprint and therefore no longer matches. Okay. The other thing, which is even more interesting, is that actually it is possible to create false positives. Very nice paper by Prokop and others from 1 year ago shows that you, given an image of a shark, you can create an image of an innocent boy, perturb the image a little bit, and make sure that the fingerprint of that image actually matches the fingerprint of the shark. And this is the example actually from the paper. What does it mean? Well, there is the risk of function creep in general. And because of the fact that there's no independent oversight, we don't see the fingerprint, we don't see the images. Anything could be added to the database, anything could be created fingerprints of, could be submitted to the service providers, and then this could be used as input for scanning. And then not only CSAM, but things like terrorist imagery, anti-Semitic imagery, whatever, any kind of like content that is not liked could be flagged and reported to the agency. This could, of course, be prevented in a certain way with proper oversight, but I mean, I'm not sure how much prevention actually will take place there. What is worse is that actually, given the techniques that I just showed you, the problems with this perceptual hashing, things like surreptitious function creep are also possible. where you taint the database with the images, with the CSAM material, with images that you generate that look like CSAM, so there are all the reasons to be in the database, but you create those images in such a way that they actually match the fingerprint of material that you want to detect, which could be any other material. Now, an independent body overseeing the database sees CSAM, but if you run the system will actually detect other material. There's also other problems. People can be falsely reported. If I happen to know the fingerprint of one piece of CSAM in the database, I can, using the techniques of Procos, create a funny cat picture, modify it a little bit such that the fingerprint matches the fingerprint in the database, send it to Bannon or to Bart, and they like funny cat pictures, so they want to share it with each other, and therefore these guys get, Bart shakes, he never forwards funny cat pictures. Okay, good to know. But you would, see, there you go. You would be reported. The other attack would be that a group of activists somehow obtain this fingerprint and decide to create funny cat pictures matching this fingerprint and massively share it with each other, creating a flood of false positives reports to the agency. And this would clog the pipeline. Now, on this pipeline, this is not an ordinary, simple thing. Like, we already know that moderation of social networks is a horrible job. It's very stressful, psychologically demanding. Here we're talking about the worst of the worst of the worst of the possible filth that you can look at. So, this is a very tightly secured pipeline with very specially trained personnel, and already now, current law enforcement capacity is not big enough to deal with current reports of CSAM that are happening. So that is already a problem. There's more fundamental objections. We have to realize that end-to-end encryption is a means to an end. And that client-side scanning breaks confidentiality of correspondence, and that the essence of the law of privacy of correspondence is that you can be sure nobody is looking at what you are corresponding. Whereas CSS basically creates a snitch that looks at every message that we send before we put it in a digital envelope and send it out. I would argue that our smartphone is our digital home. We carry it with us all the time. We share all our intimate correspondence, anything with it. And therefore it should have similar protection as the traditional home. But client-side scanning creates a first law enforcement foothold inside it. Inside our digital home. Looking at least partially to some of the things that we do all the time on our phone. And to get into this analogy of the digital home, there's other kinds of crimes that we think are very bad. Think about domestic violence. We could think of ways to fighting domestic violence by, for instance, installing a webcam in every home. It is off, but that automatically switches on if domestic violence is detected, and then a live feed of what is happening is sent to law enforcement. We would not be okay with that, but this is in essence what client-side scanning is proposing. We have mandatory age verification. This is problematic already specifically for access to communication services, but it also shows the negative aspects of the thing that Bart already talked about, the EIDAS proposal for digital identity in Europe that's being usable for not only public but also private services, because it opens the door for the verification of all kinds of like personal attributes, like age, like health, like we saw in the Corona period, before we get access. So that means that a much tighter form of access and control is being made possible, and this is just one of the examples. Even more fundamentally, I would say that the whole proposal is fighting the symptoms instead of the actual abuse, the actual thing that is bad, because most of the material that's going to be detected is going to be material that is like ages old. It's old material, being recirculated, recirculated. Nothing is being done about abuse itself. And I'm really worried about the fact that unfounded reports are kept. Also, because, the no smoke without fire, like if I'm being reported several times, even though every time it's an innocent picture, maybe somebody might think that it's worth to have a chat with me. There's an independent report by Ott van Dalen from IVER from a year ago about the fundamental rights assessment, about specifically the detection orders. The main point, the main takeaway here is that, and Bart already mentioned that also in his presentation, we have had several similar cases of mass indiscriminate surveillance in the past in Europe, the Data Retention Directive. They were struck by the Court of Justice of the EU, and it's the opinion of Ott van Dalen, a legal scholar, but also other legal scholars, that if the proposal would get through and would actually be challenged in court, then in the end at the Court of Justice, a similar decision will have to be made, because the detection orders affect the rights to privacy. But any thing that happens and that is being decided, or any measure that's being taken, must always respect the essence of the right to privacy enshrined in the Charter. And actually, in the case of data retention, the court has said that indiscriminate analysis of confidential communications affects the essence of these rights, and therefore, because the detection orders are aimed at services, not individual people, they can hardly be called proportionate. To conclude, I have a less impressive time slide than Bart has, but this is the timeline for the current proposals. The proposal was published in 2022. In 2023, in the Netherlands, we had the motion van Ginneken urging the cabinet to oppose the proposal and to fight for the right to end-to-end encryption. The cabinet decided to put that motion aside, and therefore the official position of the Dutch government is still that they are in favor of the regulation for as long as it is only limited to detecting known CSAM. You heard Patrick talk this morning about his position on this file and the fact that the European Parliament came with a totally different counter proposal. That hasn't really steered the ship to a different course, given the fact that we now have a new proposal by the EU in March. We, as scientists, wrote in 2023 an open letter, and then in 2024 another open letter. And I just learned that there's fears that there's a new proposal by Europe, where the idea is that the detection of CSAM and client-side scanning will actually be implemented for all kinds of material, but you as a user have a choice. You either accept the client-side scanning and then you can use messaging, or you don't, and you don't use messaging. And that is apparently a compromise text that is now being put in front of the member states, and it appears that this is a kind of compromise that's winning over more member states, so it might actually be the case that this proposal gets accepted. We hope not. Let us see. And this on the other side is an interesting report by Barkham Insight, together with a few other investigative journalists, who showed that Thorn, this company that I briefly mentioned during the presentation, has had a very strong influence on the development of this proposal, mainly because they will be the main seller of the technology being used to do the detection. And that is, I think, worrying from another, for different reasons, namely that, and this is again not something new, but still, apparently the Commission wants to listen to companies like Thorn, but refuses to listen to people like Bart and me and many others. Thank you for your attention. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we do.
Thank you, Jaap-Henk. I think we have 7-8 minutes or so for questions. So there's already one. Yes, please. It works.
No, two questions. The question is this was the first question. You want three?
So the first one is, you mentioned at the beginning that company has to do a risk assessment, but with this risk assessment, then what are the, I think, the parameter, what is really analyzed in this, and the second is, you mentioned that there is negligible risk of uncertainty of the situation, but are you aware of other company or entity than the Russian provider that's similar?
Let me start with the last question. That's a good point. The figure that say the very low risk of false positives for perceptual hashing actually come from the companies providing that technology. So that, as far as I know, has not been independently verified. Similar figures for different kind of technologies have been reported. We can argue whether that is trustworthy or not. With respect to the first question, it's entirely unclear to me how that risk assessment will take place. As far as I understand, the risk assessment will take place by the companies themselves. But of course, the national authorities will have something to say about that, because if every company says like, hey, look, there's nothing happening, then at some point the national authorities will say like, hey, that's weird because we have regulation, we think there's something happening. Maybe Bart knows more about this, but Bart.
Maybe I can add that. So essentially, not the EU proposal is now in the Belgian presidency.
Yeah, true.
The Commission is kind of watching.
Yeah.
Right? The Parliament is really, or the current Parliament is now standing on one side, the Council is member states pushing it.
Yeah.
So the latest drafts have very long appendages on what is high risk, right? It will be related to result. And of course, these are the critical things that will be massaging the later. For example, if you don't have too much in your name, all the services is high risk, and when it's high risk into the risk. More or less, I think what we could make up from the document is that everything like WhatsApp, Signal will only have high risk. Everything with large number of users and the description will be high risk. So we'll have to do the scanning.
Okay.
Okay. Next question. Yes, please.
Hi, I was wondering, the lawmakers, they seem to fall into the same trap over and over again. They seem to make the same mistakes. There doesn't seem to be any capacity to learn from previous strikes in the crypto war. Assuming that these people aren't stupid, which is a stretch, what can you speculate about what the real goal is here?
I don't know what the real goal is here, but I do sympathize with their predicament. And the problem is that the digital domain really works different from the older physical domain that we all come from. And we, as computer scientists, maybe understand the digital domain slightly better than these people working at the Commission, but these guys are typically not stupid, I would say, far from it. But the thing is that for all these digital technologies, you have a kind of like all or nothing kind of like thing happening. Either you have full control, or you have nothing. And both are very undesirable. The problem is that from a criminal perspective, you also have the same kind of like massive increase of scale as soon as you go digital. And you will know this from your work, from the hacking perspective, it's the same, right? So I understand that as a government, you see things evolving in a digital sphere almost without limit. Now we can argue whether this is actually happening in the case of CSAM on, for instance, messaging apps. There's a big discussion on whether this is actually happening there and whether you should not go after, say, the hosting providers, where the actual data is stored. Or we can argue about should we fight the abuse, or should we fight the images of the abuse? I mean, these are different kind of things, but in a very general sense, I understand the struggle that if you see something happening in the digital domain without any limits to scalability, what are you supposed to do as law enforcement or as governments in general to somehow mitigate this? That is, I think, the general point where they find themselves. And that's but as far as like the goal, I don't know. Like it also depends. Like Bart said, you could also, and I think I'm on Bart's camp here. Like there's so much more data and so much more metadata available to law enforcement compared to 20, 30 years ago, that the law enforcement has it's much easier to do stuff than 20, 30 years ago.
Now, respond? Yes, so I'm asking you to put this question because like exactly what you said, like there's plenty of opportunity doing forensics and stuff. Those responsibilities haven't become less in my view. So why is there always this desire for doing it on a massive scale? And exactly the thing that you point out, it's very practical if you want to use this for criminal So I guess like all the arguments, I haven't heard a counter argument for like that makes sense to me, or like someone who basically counteracts your arguments that in a way that's persuasive to me. And the same goes for Bart. Like, okay, there seems to be a path here that there's a good argument on the Bart side. They get discarded. They get like people like you don't get asked for their opinion anymore.
Not anymore. Not anymore. Not. It's not because I'm a pain in the ass, I guess.
What could be the mechanism behind the scenes? I just don't see why you keep on trying over and over again, and each time we end up with the same results.
Bart, do you want to be more cynical than me? I think you might. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it could just be very simply be we want access, period, no matter what. We were used to having access in the old days, and we want to keep access, and we don't know how to do it other way, in any other way.
Is it not simply a matter of that they then can show that they did everything they could?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that was at least the impression. Yeah. No, I mean this might be security theater for partly. Yeah, sure. And of course there's a big lobby behind it. Thorn is trying to sell something here.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the coffee break.
Yes.